The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please find your way into the waterside room. Please take a moment to silence your mobile phones and devices. Please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. For a conversation about the secret lives of cities, please welcome Ai-jen Poo, the co-founder and executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and Jose Antonio Vargas, the author of Notes of an Undocumented Citizen. They are here with Atlantic Deputy Editor Jillian White.
Hello. I cannot think of...
You're right. Sorry.
You guys got it. It's fine.
That was my fault.
Just got to slightly rearrange. I can't think of a better session to start off this afternoon with. It is called The Secret Lives of Cities, and it's called that because we are going to be investigating the so-called shadow economy. So I want to start out this conversation by kind of defining that. What are we terming the shadow economy? Who is a part of it? What type of work are they doing? Ai-jen, I want you to start.
Sure. Well, I think a lot about the women that I work with. I work with women who work in our homes as nannies, taking care of our kids, as housekeepers who clean, as home care workers who take care of the elderly and support our loved ones with disabilities. Millions of women who work behind closed doors, and you could go into any apartment building, any neighborhood, and not know which of those homes are also workplaces, because there's no registry, there's no list anywhere. It's all hidden, and it powers everything, right? We often ask our workforce, when we're in a room together, imagine Washington, D.C., if all the domestic workers decided not to go to work one day. What would happen? What would that feel like? What industries would be affected? It's the work that makes everything else possible, and yet it's hidden, often undervalued or not valued, and incredibly vulnerable in the shadows of our economy. And what's interesting about it is we think about it as in the margins and the shadows, but it's increasingly becoming more and more defining of the future, right? If you think about the conditions that define work in the shadow economy, right? Gig work, piecing it together, non-traditional workplaces without access to a safety net or benefits, without consistency of hours, right? Or job security. All of those conditions increasingly define more and more of the future of work, right? More and more of the American workforce. So we think about it as shadow, it powers everything, and it could be our future.
Yeah, and you talked about women specifically as being a huge portion of that sector. What other groups are, disproportionately represented in that sector?
It's a lot of workers of color, a lot of immigrant workers, disproportionately women in low-wage service sectors in particular, where there's not a lot of protections. Yeah.
Jose, I remember when you came forward and said, I am working in America and I am undocumented, and I remember how that just started this massive conversation about what it meant to have to try and navigate this system without the legal protections afforded that Ai-jen just talked about. I'm wondering if you can talk us through what that experience has been like.
Great. And I should just say that as someone who's Filipino, apparently we're really good caretakers. Whenever I meet somebody at the airport, they're like, oh, my nanny is so good. She's Filipina. Great. I'm mentioning this because, so when I got here, when I was 12, when my mom sent me here, I guess their plan, because they couldn't get me here legally, so they smuggled me without me knowing that I was smuggled. But the original plan was to work in the shadow economy. The original plan was I was supposed to just go through high school, and then after high school, not go to college, because this was 2000, so there was no DREAM Act, there was nothing. And then I was supposed to work at the flea market on Berryessa Road in San Jose, in California, where I'm from. And I was supposed to be a janitor. Like, that was the plan. Until I married a US citizen. I married a woman who was a US citizen. Yeah. And when my grandfather told me that this was the plan, I said, no, I'm not doing that. And that was me trying to so I did something that no one in my family does, which is I decided to be a writer, a journalist, just so I don't have to be, quote unquote, in the shadows, right? And I think as I was thinking about even the name of this panel, I kept thinking of Ralph Ellison, like the Invisible Man, right? Like, so invisible to whom exactly? Like, it's only a shadow economy because systematically we allow that. But I think everybody in this room and people watching know that, the American economy could not survive without this quote unquote shadow economy. It's there and it's in every salad you eat. right? Like, isn't everything that's cheap that you're like, why is that so cheap? Right? So I think even changing the language around that and making sure that we understand that we're actually dealing with not only workers, we're dealing with families, right? Because these workers belong to families.
Yeah. When we were talking backstage, you mentioned the idea of invisible to who or invisible to whom.
Yeah.
Right. And you said that when you were working as a journalist, you realized that this whole idea that workers are invisible is a little bit laughable because the government knows exactly where they are and tries to extract money from them.
I was working at the Washington Post, and somehow my social security number, which is invalid, was not caught by the Washington Post. So E-Verify did nothing for that. So I got, I was there, I was working, and then one day, I was living on U Street before it was U Street, before whatever that is now. And I got a piece of mail from the Social Security Administration saying I had paid this much into Social Security. And I'm like, what? So ICE, DHS can't seem to figure out where we are, but the Social Security Administration does. The IRS knows exactly where we are. So we're not invisible to them, so long as they can keep taking the money, right? And so long as people out there think that we're invisible, it's fine, right? And so I think this is a system, and we have allowed it to kind of perpetuate.
Yeah. Ajin, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about some of the protections that workers are lacking when they do not participate in what is considered the traditional economy. And I think about this in particular when you talk about women who are vulnerable populations and think about this Me Too era and how some of what I think are some of the most powerful stories have come out and are not necessarily about famous actresses, but about the women who felt like they truly had no ability and no power to come forward because losing this job would eliminate the little protection that they did have.
Right. Well, if you think about some of the questions around vulnerability to harassment or abuse in the workplace, this is a workplace where you're the only worker in the workplace, right? There's no HR department, there's no water cooler, there's not even another coworker to go to for support and to ask advice from. And there's this long history of exclusion from basic labor rights. If you think about it culturally, we don't even refer to this work as work. We call it help, right? And yet it's a full-time profession. It's a livelihood for millions and millions of workers and millions more. And in fact, because of the growing older population in this country, where the boomers are turning 70 at a rate of 10,000 people per day, 4 million people per year, and living longer than ever, home care is the fastest growing occupation in our entire economy, and the average wage is $15,000 per year. So the people we're counting on to take care of our families as our loved ones age can't take care of their own doing this work, on top of high degrees of vulnerability to abuses like sexual harassment, which ever since the Me Too movement went viral a couple of years ago, the conversation in every room where domestic workers and home care workers gather is those stories of harassment. It is like, finally, we're breaking the silence around that culture of violence. And I have to say that cities are places where we're actually able to start addressing that right now, today. To this day, there are no federal sexual harassment protections for workers in workplaces with 15 employees or less. That's effectively excluding the entire care industry, right? Where there's no federal protections from discrimination or harassment. Cities are the places where we've had the most success in addressing that. So the millions of people who fall through the cracks, cities like Seattle, cities like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. are starting to move on. How do we innovate ways to protect this workforce and support survivors who are coming forward? And in fact, the city of Seattle has been our greatest partner so far in thinking about how do we create new ways of bringing all the industry stakeholders together to be at one table, to actually, because this is a complex situation. This is not just about law and policy. This is about changing culture. Yep. There's a long-standing culture of devaluing care work, right? And invisibilizing the work that goes into caring for families. So bringing all the industry stakeholders together to think together about the future, what the standards should be, and how do we enforce those standards as families, as workers, as employers, everyone at one table. So in Seattle, we passed a standards board, a whole new model to really protect this workforce and establish standards. Philadelphia is considering, actually very soon, could be the next city to pass a domestic worker bill of rights that includes that kind of innovative structure. We're really excited about what's possible in Washington. And I just think it's like, if we think about if we're looking for signs of the future, you look to the margins, not just for the problems that are potentially the threats to potentially come in the future for everyone, but also the solutions. A lot of the most innovative ideas have been happening in the shadows, right? That can actually benefit millions of workers in the future, and cities are taking the lead.
I want to just add, I mean, there was a study that the Pew Research Center released a couple of years ago that said that there are apparently 45 million immigrants in America today, 45 million. 11 million of whom are undocumented. So I'm one of the 11 million undocumented people. There's 45 in total. In the next 50 years, according to Pew, 88% of the total US population growth is gonna come from those 45 million immigrants, right? So that's why I think when Ajin was talking about this is the future, like, and again, how do cities, because cities I think benefit from this the most. And you asked this great question about protection. You know, at Define American, our job has been like, how do we change how people see what this issue is? And for us, media is a way to do that. I mean, one thing that Ajin and I really share in common is our belief that the role of changing culture, which means the role of television and movies, right? So Define American, for example, has consulted on more than 60 television shows and films that are trying to integrate immigrant storylines, many of them in the workforce, right? There was a study that we did with the Norman Lear Center at USC that said that whenever they see Latinx people on television, mostly they're seen as domestic workers, right? Or like in kind of considered low-skilled jobs. And again, even the language around this. I don't know about you, but I come from a family of farmers in the Philippines. There's nothing low-skilled about farming. You should try it. Right? Is there anything low?
Or caregiving.
Or caregiving. Is there anything low-skilled about that? And this, to me, is the kind of the cultural shift that needs to change in terms of clearly the laws that can happen city by city, but also the way we even talk about the people and what the issue even is.
Yeah. So you were saying that you've had this insane travel schedule. When you did the math, tell us how much you've been traveling.
So honestly,
the past year.
you know, I came out as undocumented 8 years ago when President Obama was in the White House. 2011, that was the year that President Obama deported 400,000 immigrants, and I was not one of them. I don't know why. So I started an organization called Define American. So how do we use, because mine's just one story, right? How do we use stories to really combat the anti-immigrant narrative that is like a virus that has spread so wide it elected a president, right? Let me just repeat that. The anti-immigrant narrative is a virus that has spread so wide it elected a president. And guess what? It's changing Europe as we know it. Our travels at Define American has been, because look, I can't wait for DC to get its together, right? I don't know when DC is gonna figure out how to do immigration reform, whatever that even is. And if activists, for example, now that I've been in this other world and seeing kind of how activists have been organizing people, I don't know if you told people that, oh yeah, we'll make you legal, we'll get you legal, but we can't let you be citizens. I don't know if you've heard some of these reports. Or, for example, I haven't seen my mom for 26 years, right? So she sent me here. She can't even come on a tourist visa because she's not a college graduate and she doesn't own property. That tells you a lot about how she's been waiting in line legally to come for 17 years, which is how long you wait if you're from the Philippines or India. Now, if the Trump administration gets their way, they want to cut legal migration from a family-based visa, which is how there's people like me here, because they want to make it all about merit. Right? And my mom, I guess the only merit you could say is that she gave birth to me. And maybe that's not enough. So even thinking about kind of how so much of the language around this is isolated, like we isolate people from the undocumented people separate from the documented people, when in reality, the undocumented population, as Ajin knows, like we all live in the same households, right? And for us, like figuring out, again, like how, from where I'm coming from as a journalist and as a filmmaker, like storytelling is the only place that can hold all the complexity and the nuance around these issues. Politics will not do that. They're too busy trying to get elected and telling you what you need to hear, versus what the complexity and what the nuances are in this situation.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because the immigration narrative is so often an us and them narrative, and yet the industry with the largest concentration of undocumented immigrants in the country is domestic work. So these are the people, humans, who are raising our children, walking with us through life, nurturing the human potential of the people we love the most, upholding the human dignity of the people who raised us, right? What could be more important? We're already so interdependent and interconnected. And the idea that we could somehow be torn apart, right, is actually not tenable. And when we do think about the growing aging population, many cities are grappling with a growing aging population of older people who want to age in place and in their homes and in their communities, right, which is different from previous generations. We're going to need a huge caregiving workforce to support a dignified quality of life for all of us, including older immigrants, right? And there's no way to do that without a really strong immigrant inclusive workforce. Immigrant, non-immigrant, all of us, young, old. It's an all hands on deck situation to care for American families in the future. And so even just looking at through the care lens alone, there is no way that it's an us and them situation.
I want to follow up on that for 1 second, because it ties back into, Jose, what you said about the idea that fear of immigrants and this narrative that has been created got a president elected. And how do you think that gap works of both people having people in their homes who are working and they consider part of their family, who are with them day to day, but then when they go to the polls, they are not thinking about those people? How does that happen, and then how do you change that, and will it be changed in time for the next presidential election?
Yes?
That's all yours.
I think that this is a question of narrative and culture and engagement. And I do believe in what Brian Stevenson talks about, which is proximity. And whether it's through story or whether through actual proximity, it does really make a difference. The way that immigration is framed as an issue, when people experience the people in their lives who are caring for them, it often feels like a separate thing from the way we talk about immigration.
Yes.
So we need people and stories to help make the connection between the two, so that people understand that when they're in the ballot box, when they're kind of voting, that this is what's at stake, right? These humans, these relationships, these people we know, right? I think that will make a huge difference.
So we were talking about travel. So ever since I came out and started Define American, so I've done 1,800 events in 49 states in 8 years. And I've tried as much as possible, like maybe a third of them in conservative Republican areas. I just wrote a book, and the freshmen at Louisiana State University were required to read the book over the summer. So my publisher was like, that's a lot of books, go over there. So I went to Baton Rouge in Louisiana and met with the 900 kids who had to read the book. And it was fascinating how they've grown up on Fox News their entire lives. So seeing like a non-Latino, English-speaking one was like, you seem like such a nice guy. I was like, well, what did you think? You know? Proximity, and this is why the role of media. Define American a few years ago partnered with MTV. We did a 1-hour special called White People, which was inspired by my traveling across the country. Whenever I talked about immigration in the South and the Midwest, the conversation at the end was always about race. And so I did this documentary for an hour. It premiered literally a month after Trump announced he was running for president. And part of the film, MTV did a study. I was surprised about this. 75% of white people live in predominantly white towns, and 90% of white people have predominantly white friends. And no amount of listening to Drake and Rihanna changes that, right? Like, so proximity to people like us, the only proximity a lot of white people have in places that are not urban areas are the television shows they watch, the films they see, right? The narrative that Fox News has built since I was in middle school, right? We are now living through the narrative consequences of the past 25 years. That's how Trump got elected. And I have to say, us in the mainstream media have also been a part of the challenge here. I remember when The Atlantic a few months ago had a cover story by David Frum that said, how much is too much immigration, right? And at Define American, we actually, two of the themes that we really, from a storytelling perspective, promote is bondedness, what bonds us together, right? And abundance. So when people say, oh, there's too many of you, we're overpopulated. Have you been to Idaho? I have. It's not that overpopulated. I was in Boise just last week. We had Define America, we organized a meeting with the Dairymen Association. 85% of dairy workers in the state of Idaho are undocumented. And the Dairymen's Association are like, how can we get the red state of Idaho to realize that these people, we go to the guy who's the head of this association was speaking, and I quoted, we were talking about this quote that I have to find out who said this quote, but it's from Europe. We asked you for workers, you sent us people. So I said that in this meeting, and I said, sir, we are more than your labor, right? Like, we're actually, we are people. And then he started talking about how close the Dairymen Association were to the workers. They go to the quinceañeras, they go to the, so for me, let's lean in on that. Yeah. Let's lean in on what actually you have together, and families, you have that in common, the Polish and the Swedish who helped make Idaho what it is. What does that make different from the Mexicans and the Guatemalans who are now making up your workforce? Okay. So that, for me, is a big part, I think, of the work, the engagement. I love that you said that, Aijen. I think engagement has to be a big part of this.
And I think cities have a huge role to play.
I was going to say, if we can talk about what you think are the core things that cities need to be paying attention to and the core things that cities need to be changing in order to serve this population better and to create better protections. And, as you said, to prepare for the future where more workers are going to be in what has traditionally been considered a marginalized area.
Yeah. I think cities can help social movements like my organization scale the best solutions. An example is we created a portable benefits platform, the first of its kind in the country, called ALIA. The URL is myalia.org. And it basically allows for domestic workers with multiple clients to get access to benefits for the very first time. So you can, every time you have a domestic worker comes and cleans your home, you add a small contribution that goes into her benefits fund. She gets to decide which benefit she wants to apply the money in her fund towards, and it follows her. Cities can help us scale the adoption of platforms like ALIA, and it's accessible to anyone and everyone. And as soon as we get it to scale for domestic workers, we can bring it to any number of sectors and industries where workers have a hard time getting access to benefits because of the structure of their industry. So that's the kind of thing where there's so much opportunity when we actually lean in and think about what are the best ideas and how can cities utilize their platforms to help us grow them and make them the new normal. Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot of, you asked this a few minutes ago. I've been thinking a lot about, so if I as an undocumented person in this country, if I don't have rights from the federal government, who do I get it from? I just recently moved to Berkeley. I'm from the Bay Area, so I moved to the Republic of Berkeley. And so I'm in this really interesting conversation with the city about, well, wait a second. So I'm a property paying, I pay taxes in the city of Berkeley, right? I live in Berkeley. I pay taxes every year, which the IRS is happy to take. But what exactly am I a part of here, right? Like, it's a relationship, right? Like, what is the relationship between the city and me? And again, I don't know what the federal government is going to do, but what I do know is, in many ways, the freedom of undocumented people and immigrant workers are going to rely on the cities and the municipalities, and what laws they're willing to pass that would make us feel more seen and more included and feel like we belong in our communities. So I think that, to me, is where we have to focus on. We can't focus too much on what's happening in DC, where nothing is happening, where we have to go, I think, city by city by city.
Yeah. Well, I could stay up here and talk about this all day, but I think we'll end there. Please join me in thanking Aijen and Zach.
On the architecture of hope, reinventing the public library, welcome Tommi Laitio, the Executive Director of Culture and Leisure for the City of Helsinki, Finland.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to use this opportunity to tell you a story of a civic institution changing both its city and changing with its city. But I want to go back a bit and kind of give you the context of where I come from. This is a picture from my city 100 years back. Just a couple of months after the country gained its independence, the country slided into a very bloody civil war where people killed 37,000 of their fellow new citizens in bloody battles and concentration camps around the country. These are children in my city now. Finland was twice selected as the happiest country in the world a while back. I could list several rankings where Finland and Helsinki rank high on government safety, on livability, on quality of life, on kind of learning results in schools and so on. But I kind of want to point out that this progress from one of the poorest countries in Europe to one of the most prosperous countries in Europe hasn't been an accident. It's been based on this idea that when you're as few as we are, 5 million people, you have to make sure that everyone can live up to their fullest potential. We come from a country where being a teacher is one of the most valued professions. I know. And our society is fundamentally dependent on people trusting the kindness of strangers, kind of believing in sharing and learning with other people. Schools and libraries have played a crucial role in making the country and Helsinki as a city what it is at the moment. Finnish people borrow, on average, 15.6 books from the library every year, which is 10 more than here in the US. But everything's not good. Still, in all this wonderful livability and safety and democratic city, people somehow seem on the edge. People are afraid of climate change. People are afraid of the future of democracy, on how globalization will affect us. Will you die alone? Will your children blame you? In a way, you know this discussion. Is a robot going to replace me? And the difficult thing is that when people feel like everything's shaking, they don't really act smart. When people are afraid, they start focusing on short-term, selfish solutions and focusing on survival. And what happens also is that people start searching for scapegoats. In a way, you start searching for someone who can take the pain away. You blame immigrants, conservatives, liberal elites, social media, traditional media, you get the drift. To highlight this, there was a recent academic survey in Finland that showed that 60%, 60, of the respondents said that they were hesitant to take part in public discussion, especially online, due to its hostile and polarizing nature. And I don't blame people if you look at what happens around us. It's kind of understandable that when you feel like everything's shaking around you, you focus on the areas that you can control. You focus on family, you focus on work and your home. But while this is very understandable on an individual level, a democratic city cannot function without a democratic public. And this is where kind of new solutions come in. So 100 years after my first image, we opened a new central library in Helsinki. It had been in the making for 10 years. The lot designated for the library to celebrate Finland's centennial independence couldn't be more central. It's right next to the central railway station, right opposite to the national parliament. It's probably it is the most expensive vacant piece of land in the whole country that was designated to a completely non-commercial building. The city carried out an open and anonymous architectural competition based on 2,000 dreams that were collected from people over 10 years. And the building has 3 floors, and the architects kind of managed to combine all the 2,000 dreams into this one building. So on the ground floor, it's kind of an extension of the public square with a cafe, a cinema, event space, and information points. You take the stairs up, and it becomes much more intimate with music studios, meeting rooms, sewing machines, 3D printers. And finally, you take the stairs up and you enter book heaven. The idea is that you have 100,000 books, you have lots of natural light on this floor, and beautiful wooden surfaces. The symbolism of this building is very much built into its architecture. When you go on the balcony on the 3rd floor, you stand on the same level as members of the parliament on the other side of the street, which is a position not available for people before this. In its first year, Ode in English, the library has won the award for the best new public library in the world. It's been on the cover of the New York Times. It's been named by Time magazine as 100 places to visit in the world this year. But more important than that, it's loved by the local people. We have 10,000 physical visits in this library every day. In a couple of weeks, we're going to break 3 million visits this year in this library, which is a lot in a city of 650,000 people. I think it's a lot for a library in any city. It's probably the most diverse place in our city in many ways. It is used by seniors, it's used by refugees, it's used by families with children, it's used by design tourists and CEOs. It's hosted a feminist one-week festival and the launch of Finnish government's new program. It's used by people from the countryside waiting for a train with their trolley, and it's used by the skateboarders outside the building who just need to use the bathroom. But it's also used for the traditional purpose of libraries, as in borrowing books. Actually, book loans in Helsinki at the moment are on a 5% incline, which is globally quite rare. But people also come to study for exams, they come to hem their trousers, they come to have a meeting with their NGO, they come to print massive stickers with our massive sticker printer machines. And they come to record a music demo for their new band. The building's commitment to openness and welcoming without judgment is also communicated in its art. This artwork by a Finnish artist, Otto Karvonen, on its main staircase is an endless list of groups that the building is dedicated to, which is crowdsourced from the public. His idea is that every person should find at least 3 groups that you belong to on this staircase. So the building is dedicated, amongst others, to lazy bones, reading clubs, the hounded, romantics, adopted people, the misguided, introverts, the childless, and yes, rich folk. During the opening weekend, we saw that this is working. We actually saw people tearing up when they realized that this building is created for them. With the library, the city communicates that we see your value and you deserve the best. Libraries have this radically generous assumption of people. Libraries see every person as unique, responsible, and curious. And it's amazing what happens when you treat people this way. The building is open from 8 in the morning till 10 in the evening. We have 2 security guards in the building, seldom working at the same time. So in a way, like when you trust people, they trust you back. I strongly believe, based on this experience that we've had over the last year, that people's belief in democracy requires regular, real experiences with other people. In Ode, the library, we coexist rather than try to make people friends with each other. And we support this peaceful coexistence by having a very simple set of rules for a safer space that was created with our patrons. And those rules apply to the Prime Minister, to the homeless Roma people, or the visiting Crown Princess of Japan. We do not ask people to justify why they come in and how long they stay. And I know personally how important that is. When I was growing up in Finland in the early 1990s, I used to sneak into our local library because they had the national LGBT magazine. And I took it from the shelf, I put it inside a political weekly, sort of like the Atlantic, and I went to a corner to read it in case someone would see me. I wanted to understand that what is this scary thing that's happening inside me that's probably going to affect my future in many ways. And I wasn't ready to discuss that with other people. And I felt that the library, better than any other civic institution, provided that safety for me. And it's wonderful, even in the era of internet, our librarians see these journeys still every day, that people use the library for that. And libraries have this incredible potential to have this promise that you can build your best future here. You can be your best person in this building. 100 years back, libraries played a crucial role in democratizing learning and reading. And of course, they still hold those tasks. But I think if we look at the contemporary challenges that we have in our cities, we have to think about the role of libraries in a larger way. Libraries have a massive potential in bridging the digital divide, bringing together the parallel realities in our cities, or building hope and action around climate change. But that requires that we're willing to change an institution. I think in too many cities, libraries have become an extension of social work than a place for the whole community to come together. In too many cities, libraries are a place that everyone kind of values in principle, but very few use in practice. And I think we lose out on their democratic potential if we let that go. We cannot live together only in principle. We have to live together in practice. And that means that we have to think of the services in a different way. I think all social classes need regular, real experiences of living side by side with other people. That's why next to language courses for recent migrants, our libraries grant digital access to fashion publications like Vogue. Why we loan out sports gear. Why we bring best-selling authors to the libraries. Why we just launched a personal trainer service for readers. Or why we just partnered up with a Major League basketball team so that we have 4 seasonal tickets for their games, which you can borrow from the library. And when this was launched, it's been copied in so many municipalities now. Our idea is that libraries shouldn't be the last resort. They should really be a place for everyone. And this seems to work. As a sign of success, we've issued 15,000 new library cards over the last year in our central library alone. Our library attendance in Helsinki is up by 50% from last year. In a city of 650,000 people, we will have over 10 million physical visits in libraries this year. This building cost 98 million euros to build. Our library system cost 35 million euros to run. But to put it another way, I don't think 50 euros per person for restoring people's hope in living together is a bad investment. If you want to learn more, there are direct flights to Helsinki from 5 American cities.
For a session produced by our underwriter, welcome Jamal Clark, Program Manager, Plaza West, and Andy Navarrete, Executive Vice President and Head of External Affairs at Capital One.
Thank you, everyone, and really it's just a privilege to be able to address such a distinguished audience. I'm Andy Navarrete. I head External Affairs for Capital One, and I have with me today Jamal Clark, Community Life Program Manager, a vastly superior title, for the Plaza West development. It's a very unique community that you'll be hearing a little bit more about in a moment, just north of here. We understand that we're the last panel between you and the keynote from Dave Grohl, and having seen Dave and the Foo Fighters open the Anthem nightclub just down the road, we have learned the lesson of every smart opening act, which is keep it short and focus on your hits. And so in that spirit, a quick conversation about a very, very daunting topic, I would imagine, for many of you and your communities and the communities that you serve, which is the crisis of affordable housing in this country. Now, oftentimes when we talk about affordable housing, we talk about it in the context of availability. But the fact is that one of the major challenges is not only making housing available, but making communities sustainable. And so if you'll indulge me, on your seats or underneath your seats, you have a card with a particular identity associated with it. And so we'd love for you to, we're not going to quiz you on it, but we'd love you to sort of pull that out and to look at the description of the individual that is on that card. And the purpose of this exercise is to think about affordable housing in a slightly different way, which is this notion of serving the unique needs of particular constituencies and certain communities. Because if you're going to build sustainable and successful affordable housing, you need to, one, understand those individual needs and circumstances. I mean, whether you're a veteran who is trying to transition back into the workforce, whether you're somebody who has struggled with homelessness or mental illness and needs supportive services to address the many challenging circumstances and needs. Whether you're an elderly retiree on a fixed income and suddenly finding yourself with childcare responsibilities at a stage in life where maybe you hadn't planned for that. And that is, in many respects, the unique story of Plaza West. But we want you then, as you think about the individual circumstances on the card, to think about what kinds of supportive services would help you navigate the environment in which you've found yourself. And so when you think about financial literacy courses, when you think about workforce development activities, when you think about all of the community programming that many organizations, including Capital One, are very, very proud to support, integrating that into affordable housing is something that we have found is absolutely critical. Capital One started, its origin story is a company that sought to reach the underserved market in banking and financial services by recognizing that one size fits all doesn't work for most communities. And so what I have found so intriguing and so inspiring about Jamarl's story and the story of Plaza West was that they identified a very, very particular need in this community. Over 1,000 families in DC are qualified as grandfamilies. And this is where grandparents are suddenly found with the responsibility for caring for their grandchildren. Now, as you might imagine in those circumstances, in the vast majority of cases, no formal adoption takes place. And when you think about navigating the legal system, when you think about the eligibility for subsidized housing, what you find is that there are gaps in the law that don't accommodate these communities. And so this was the insight that Jamarl and the developers of Plaza West had, and where we wanted to partner. And if you go to the Capital One About page, you can find out about other communities serving veterans, those individuals with mental illness, artists, all sorts of different communities, again, with these sort of unique needs. But let me turn to you, Jamarl, and tell us a little bit about the aha moment that you had that found you pursuing this work and the inspiration behind Plaza West.
Yeah, I only got 5 minutes to sell this to everybody to do it in your city. I mean, the thing is, it was a vision of Bible Way Church. Bible Way Church in DC has been around for over 80 years. And the pastor, Pastor Smallwood, in the 80s, with the crack epidemic, he knew that he wanted to do an intergenerational center. So many years later, Bible Way Church decided to go into affordable housing and saw a 60-minute piece about grandfamilies and decided, you know what, we're going to do housing strictly for grandparents that are raising grandchildren. It's a demographic that has been left out. It's nothing new. Raise your hand if your grandmother or your grandpa raised you. All right. A lot of people were raised by their grandparents. However, grandparents were not given the support that they needed in terms of financial, and the biggest thing that we see in our world is shelter.
So tell me about some of the circumstances that lead to these sort of unique housing arrangements. I know that oftentimes it can be very challenging, and can be very challenging not only for the grandparents, but for the children involved. So tell me a little bit about maybe some of the backstories of some of the residents of Plaza West.
Yeah, so most of our grandparents, they lost a child. A lot of them are grieving. I had grandparents that were moving in a week after burying their child. And in that moment, we had to figure out how we could get all the resources that they need. We've had parents that have, they've been incarcerated, and the list goes on, but those are two of the main ones, is incarcerated and grieving families. And you see a lot of tears at Plaza West, but you see a lot of hope too, because this is a place that they can come to and get resources that they need to be successful. There's 50 grandfamilies total, including our youth. It's 133. Most of the population, 88 of them are youth. So it's really loud at Plaza West in a couple hours.
So Jamarl, tell me about some of the specialized supportive services that you offer as part of your programming.
Yeah, we have a strong partnership with Howard University School of Social Work. They provide a monthly support group. We also have the YMCA that comes in and does chair aerobics. I'm doing it because I participate with them as well. I think I've lost 1 pound. And we've had tutoring on site. And we're continuing to evolve in what programs do they need. We want to be very intentional about who come through our doors, all right? We've only been around for a year. We've only been open for a year. It feels like 10 years. However, we are really trying to see how the population of seniors, and we start at 50 years old and up, and then our youth that come in under 17 years old, they have 2 separate needs, right? And we're trying to marry those needs. Saturday, we had a fall festival. They packaged the cupcakes. There was like, the kids are gonna get the cupcakes at the end of the event, Mr. Clark. I said, please let them live. Give them the cupcakes. But it's that example of older adults versus the youth. And our office is right in the middle to bring that connection together.
So while I struggle with the notion that being 50 qualifies me as a older, I'll try to gloss right past that. Tell me a little bit about some of the benefits. We talk about, you can find these kinds of services elsewhere. You can find affordable housing that is more sort of available to broader populations. But tell me some of the unique benefits of actually bringing these individuals and these communities together. So, when these grand families get to interact, what do you see sort of come from that experience?
I see community. I see them work together. I see them take turns driving the kids to school. I see them supporting each other and relating with one another if it's pertaining to grieving. They have similar stories. No longer are their kids, their grandchildren in the classroom saying, oh, I'm one of the few that's being raised by my grandparent. They live in a housing development with other grandchildren. They are all in the same boat. I have watched them come together. They have planned events together. They have their own T-shirt. I was like, when do you all design a T-shirt? They no longer, they're able to pull on each other for strength. And it's amazing to watch them walk by my office, if they're not knocking on my door, and just see them smiling as they're just embracing each other.
So Jamal, I'll give you the last word. 25 seconds to tell me the one thing you want this audience to know about Plaza West.
You should do it in your city. And that's simple as that, you should do it in your city. If you need the help, call us. But we have to look out for this population, okay? We have senior housing, we have veteran housing, we have to have grand family housing. And that's what we're doing. If you want to learn more about our work, I see 000, please contact us. And thank you so much, Andy.
Okay, thank you all.
Please welcome Dave Grohl and Atlantic Editor-in-Chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Hello. Oh, I like the intro music.
That was Foo Fighters.
Was that
right?
you?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, that's
that
our
was
new
my
record.
little
We
side
came here to
gig doing piano elevator music for CityLab. Dave.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.
I don't do this very often.
We don't do this very often.
I'm flattered.
We're all good. So I just want to. I have to say at the outset, in the interest of full disclosure, that I consider Dave Grohl to be, at least in the non-senior citizen division, the greatest living rock star. So this is
going great.
That's where you applaud. The under 70.
We're off to a good start.
Yeah, the under 70 division, because a certain somebody just turned 70, as you know. Springsteen just turned 70.
Oh,
so
yeah, huh?
Yeah, and he's still going.
Wow, that's terrible.
But so but he looks good.
I pray that I look like Bruce. Well, I've always prayed that I look like Bruce Springsteen. But yeah.
He looks great. And so the point is that this is not going to be, and I'm just saying this in the interest of journalistic full disclosure, not going to be the hardest hitting interview in the history of the world. This is not like Mike Pompeo in Ukraine or something. Although, if you want to answer questions about Ukraine,
Just don't make me cry.
no, that's right. So we're gonna talk along the theme of this conference. But those of you who don't know Dave Grohl, actually one of the reasons that Dave is here is that he did a wonderful 8-part series for HBO called Sonic Highways. And we'll talk about it in a minute. But before we get to that, I just maybe we can talk a little about your early days here in this very city. I first knew a little bit about Dave Grohl when he was in a band called Scream, which was like 35 years ago.
It was the mid-'80s.
It was the mid-'80s, but my full consciousness of Dave Grohl happened when a lot of people got full consciousness of Dave Grohl during the Nirvana period, and then of course immense long-term success with Foo Fighters. But let's talk about DC and talk about how this particular area shaped your musical development.
Well, one of the great things about Washington, D.C. is, first of all, there's a lot of musical diversity, right? So from the different neighborhoods that sort of represent different culture to the different styles and genres of music, you had everything. You know, there was kind of a Southern rock influence. You had bands like, remember the Road Ducks? Okay, yeah, you don't know what that. But there was.
You have to say it that way?
Yeah, you do. That's how you pronounce it. It's the Road Ducks. And then you had this really influential and important underground punk rock scene here. And then you also had go-go music, which is a specific type of funk that really is only in Washington, D.C.
Right.
So there was something, and it was a small community of musicians that I think were all doing it just for the sake of playing music. So it really was a community in that people would help and support each other.
Right. I mean,
And
both
very independent too.
on both sides of that divide. I mean, actually, it's kind of almost a Rock Creek Park divide. On the west side of the park, there is Ian MacKaye and Minor Threat, and on the east side of the park, there is Trouble Funk and Chuck D.
That's
right. Actually, this is a good moment if we can queue up. We have about a 30-second clip from Sonic Highways. We can run that, the one on Washington D.C., and you can get a little sense of what we're talking about.
It takes a certain amount of willpower. Not only us, any band in this town.
We was like recording this music, man. We was like putting out music like every other week. And the music was like spreading like a disease.
The DIY thing carries through a lot of different music scenes in DC. I'm sure you've experienced this, where you run into some guy who's like a jazz guy or some funk player. You're from the punk scene, and you guys relate in a way that's very Washington, D.C. like language.
I saw a real parallel with the Go-Go thing, but never could connect with them because they were a totally different world. And then we decided, like, we should play with Trouble Funk. They've headlined, we opened for them. Big Boys, Minor Threat, Trouble Funk. Trouble Funk were interested in it because they heard about the punk scene. We were into it because we love the Go-Go thing.
Then there's these punk funk shows.
Yeah. They both were like two underground type of sounds. And it just goes together.
Yeah, I mean, it really did, there was a DC sound. And that series, the Sonic Highways series, had a lot to do with how the environment, the atmosphere of the place that you're making music, how that influences the sound of the music. So we went to 8 different cities, and there was a time when everything wasn't so interconnected, that places really did have a regional identity. And inevitably, that would sort of make its way into the music. And the music then sort of becomes the sound or the soundtrack to that city. So if you were to talk about, if you mention Chicago, music from Chicago, most people think, oh, the blues. If you mention Nashville, most people think, oh, the Grand Ole Opry. With Washington, D.C., it wasn't as mainstream as that, but the music, the punk rock music and the underground rock and roll, it just sounded different than anywhere else. As with the go-go scene, which really was so regional that it barely made it to Baltimore. But that becomes a part of the city's identity that you're proud of, and also the ethics within that. So like the DIY thing that Ian Mackay was talking about, to me, that's like in my formative years as a musician, that's how I learned to become a musician. I didn't go on The Voice and sing something once and start flying G4s all over the place. It started here in like basements and bars and learning how to work within a community and doing things yourself. So it's actually how the Foo Fighters still work. I'm the president of our record company, and all I do is I make records and I license them to Sony BMG, and nobody tells us what to do or how to do it and when to do it, and it's the reason why we've survived for 25 years, and I learned it from that guy here in Washington, D.C. when I was 15 years old.
Talk a little bit, stay on Washington for a second. One of the interesting things about it is look, it's historically been a racially divided city. You're in this particular episode of Sonic Highways, you're dealing very straight on with the fact that one type of music is developing on this side of the city, another type is developing on that. But there was overlap. There was a kind of joint appreciation that you didn't find in necessarily other sectors of society, especially around that time. Talk about it in the context of race a little bit in this particular region.
I've never felt like race made any difference with music at all. I honestly have never. I've been in bands with African Americans. I've been in bands with people that grew up in Arlington, Virginia, in big beautiful houses. I've played in bands with people that grew up in Southwest, and I honestly have. I feel like music, and it sounds trite and it might seem silly, but I honestly believe it's the one thing that everyone can come together with. When I go out and play a Foo Fighters show and there's 50,000 people and they all sing a song like My Hero or Learn to Fly or something, when there's 50,000 people singing together in chorus, all of those lines just sort of disappear. And they might be singing those songs for 50,000 different reasons, but I get to bring them all together in that one moment, so it doesn't matter like what side of the aisle they're on or what church they go to, whatever it is. I honestly believe that music is the thing that can really bring people together.
I want to ask you a question about a club that was very, very important in your development, 930 Club.
Yeah.
The original 930 Club. Yeah. Talk about that, and this is an audience filled with mayors, filled with city planners. I shouldn't say everyone wants to have a 930 Club, because there's also these noise issues and all the other issues that I think mayors
rats, dude. They had big rats.
It was the original 930
big
Club.
Rats.
The original 930 Club, you can get Ebola in the bathroom. I mean, it was bad.
It's pretty bad.
But talk about having that kind of place and what it does to help a musical ecosystem develop in a particular place.
Well, I think that it's important. I have 3 children. I have 3 daughters. One of them is now 13 and becoming a musician. And of course, I help facilitate that, whether it's giving her some instruments to learn or a place to record into a microphone, whatever it is. Not every kid has that place to go or has that opportunity. I think that making those things available to kids is very important for lots of reasons, but mostly because I think it makes them happy. And a community that has a rich and exciting, vibrant music scene, I think that it brings a lot of happiness to the place where it is. I've always felt like in America, when we did the Sonic Highways TV thing, I felt like there wasn't enough music on television. When you travel the world, like if you're awake at 11:30 at night in Italy and you turn on Rai Uno, you're going to see someone singing opera. You're going to see some festival performance in a park somewhere. It's just sort of like more like a part of the general consciousness, and I think that it sort of it's important. It's like air. It's important. You need to have that in your life just to remind you that, life's worth living. So somewhere like the 930 Club, it was a dump, but it was important to generations of people that found inspiration in that crappy little room to go on and do the things that they, wound up doing in life. And I feel like, we had that club, but then we would also play in like art galleries and community centers and things like that. But I do think that all of the places that you're from deserve to have an opportunity like that for people to go to experience music, people to learn how to play music, for people to share music with each other and build a community. Because now, when I talk about Washington, D.C., I'm proud of being from Washington, D.C. When I say I'm a musician from Washington, D.C., people think like, wow, you're a badass. And I agree.
Can I ask you? Some people don't like Washington, D.C., by the way. I don't know if
a
you're
lot of
aware
people
that
don't
out
like
in
Washington,
America,
D.C.,
but that's another subject.
Yeah.
Stay on this for 1 second before we drive across the country to Seattle. Yeah. One part of this question, or this mystery about why certain cities develop these vibrant music scenes, is the physical ecosystem, the clubs, but another is the presence of certain geniuses, right? Like in this case, it's like Ian MacKaye, who fronted Minor Threat and then Fugazi, and on the other hand, Chuck Brown. Basically, without those two, we're talking about the musical forms that we're talking about associated with Washington. Would this kind of thing happen? I mean, what's more important to it, the broad ecosystem, or like just the serendipitous appearance of truly original musicians?
Well, you have to have visionaries. You have to have people that will think outside of the norm. So, most people would think, oh God, I can't start a band. I'm not an accomplished musician, and I know nothing about the music industry. And so none of us did. And so when we started playing and writing songs and recording and making records when we were young, we didn't know what we were doing. So there was no right or wrong. We were just doing it the way we imagined it should be done. And in doing that, you do things differently, and I think that leads to change. Or progress. So you're doing things outside of the norm or the way people normally do them. No, I think there are thousands of musicians in this city right now that could go on to change the course of popular music or whatever it is they do. They just need the opportunity to do it. And they need for someone to tell them like, oh no, that's available to you, and you're entirely capable of doing it. You have to be, it's one of the being a parent, it's one of the things that I tell my kids. When I was young, I thought I could do anything. I felt, except to go to college, I thought I could do pretty much anything. I thought if I just put my mind to it, I'm just going to figure it out and I'm going to do it. I still feel that way. I don't know, I'm not a director. I don't know how to make TV shows, but I did a fucking HBO series. So it's funny. I honestly, and I think that we did something that people hadn't done yet. And I'm very proud of that. But I'm also proud, when I was asked to come here to talk today, they said, what are you talking about? I said, I haven't the slightest idea. And they said, really? How come they called you? I'm like, I have no clue. And that's kind of how I float through life. Kids, stay in school, don't do drugs.
Is the actual answer don't do drugs, or just do the right amount of drugs?
No, don't do the drugs.
All right.
You can't, no, I'm not saying that. Don't do the drugs.
There might be law enforcement
this
here.
is live streaming or something.
Let's go out to Seattle, and before you address Seattle, there's one more clip that we should show from Sonic Highways about Seattle.
I think a lot of bands would skip Seattle because it was just too far of a drive.
If you're in a band and you're traveling around in a van, and the kind of information traveled the way it did at that time, you're really going to drive 900 miles from California to play a show to 5 people in Seattle?
Nowadays, everything's interconnected so much that all you have to do is pick up your laptop and see what's going on Tuesday night at that tiny club in Portland, Maine. When I was young, as a touring musician, it was a crapshoot. You never knew if the promoter had put flyers on the street. You never knew if the college radio station was playing your band's music. You'd show up to a club and cross your fingers that people would come to the gigs so that you could get gas money to go to the next city.
From Minneapolis to Seattle is 2,000 miles. Good luck on getting any shows in Spokane or anything, forget it, you know.
I got the real sense as a kid that, you know, the scene in Seattle created itself because nobody else wanted to come up and entertain Seattleites, you know? I mean, people had to kind of start their own bands and their own scene because that was the only way live music was gonna get played here.
Because nobody was gonna make any money, the scene was a network of hobbyists who are just playing for their friends. And when you're playing music as a hobby, you take more risks. And from that attitude, a lot of these bands kind of created their own style.
It's absolutely true.
So you try out to be the drummer of Nirvana. You get the gig. You go to Seattle. What do you find when you go to Seattle? What shocked you the most about the music scene compared to what you knew?
Well, the isolation. First of all, the rain. You know, a part of that conversation that we were just watching had to do with the isolation, and that Seattle kind of lived in its own funny little cultural biodome for the longest time. You know, they just figured, well, nobody cares. We're so far away, and what do we have? You know, fish and Bill Gates or whatever. That, you know, that we'll just sort of do our own thing. So when I got there, you know what? When I first got there, I hadn't joined Nirvana yet, but I went to go see them play. And so you have to understand, at the time, if you were an underground band and 500 people came to see your band, you were considered huge, right? I went to this Nirvana show at this warehouse, and there were 1,000 people. And they were just on an independent label in town. But what I noticed was the identity, that the audience, they weren't like spiked hair and chains and leather jackets. They were they looked like kids from trailer parks. They had like flannel shirts that they got at the Fred Meyer or the Salvation Army, and they wore like Converse Chucks and ripped up jeans, and they just looked like derelicts. I don't know how to say it, but it was not a punk rock scene, but it was a youth-driven. I mean, it seemed almost like a movement, and whatever it was about the music, the sound, or the lyric, these people were connecting to what was going on. These kids were connecting to what was going on in a way that doesn't happen often. It happens just before a musical revolution, and that's what was happening. So I remember that, but again, coming from Washington, D.C., you know what? When I came to Seattle, you know what I said I was from Washington, D.C., all they did was grill me on all the bands that I'd seen. Did you get to see Rites of Spring? I'm like, yeah. Oh my God, did you get to see Marginal Man? I'm like, yeah. Like, so that, I mean, to me, that meant like, coming from Washington, D.C., again, they were like, wow, that guy's from D.C. So, but, you know, at the time, the city hadn't turned into the Seattle that it eventually became. And it all happened really quickly. So there were 4 or 5 bands that blew up really quickly in a matter of months. And then it became the Seattle that, you know, designers started selling flannel shirts for $800, and it changed. But what I did notice is that it was the same sort of community that we had here in DC. And I think, you know, when Bruce Pavitt, the owner of the guy that ran Sub Pop Records, when he talks about like the hobbyist versus the careerist, that says a lot. Because I think that most of the people that started playing music in these cities didn't necessarily aspire to be the next biggest rock star in the world. They just, like, they had to do something other than, you know, I worked at Marlowe's Furniture Warehouse. And so I would shove trucks full of like sleeper couches all day long. I could not wait to play my instrument at the end of the day. Not because I wanted to be a gigantic rock star. I just needed to beat the crap out of something because I was so sick of working at Marlowe's Furniture Warehouse. And I think that most musicians, like if it really comes from like the deep down place, then that kind of thing doesn't really matter. Yeah.
I want to thank our underwriter, Marlowe's Furniture Warehouse, for...
I think it's still there.
It is still there.
It is,
it's
right?
absolutely still there.
Well, it used to be the largest furniture showroom in the DC metropolitan area. I remember that.
Answer this question because, Springsteen, I don't mean to keep bringing him up.
What's up with your obsession with Bruce Springsteen? Sorry, Bruce Springsteen couldn't make it.
I'm sorry.
Jeez, Jeff. Just little old me.
Yeah, no, little old me. Right? Yeah. No, I've been to like 10 Foo Fighters shows, but 80 Springsteen shows, so I apologize in advance. But so have you, probably. No, I love Foo Fighters.
I love the Atlantic, too. It's my favorite.
I got to go to Marlowe's. I got to go to Marlowe's and buy a closet and hide in.
Yeah.
So the aforementioned rock star from New Jersey once said that the thing about the sound that he developed in the 70s and 80s, that Asbury Park was isolated, even from New York. It's only an hour drive, but it's still isolated. They didn't know what they were making, so they just made music that they thought they could make. Before Springsteen, Asbury Park was not Asbury Park, right? And so I think, in listening to what you're talking about here with Seattle, the isolation allows you to just experiment without too much homogenization, too much outside influence in a kind of way. And so the question is, are we losing something now? You pick 8 very specific and very, very different cities for your series. And so the question is technology, is the internet. You can go on YouTube right now and watch any band in a live performance anywhere in the world. What are we losing by having that kind of ubiquity?
Human interaction, which is important. I think just as we talked about community, I think that it's one thing to see an artist or a song in a one-dimensional way. But what's really inspiring is when you see an actual human being on stage with an instrument made of wooden wires and one microphone do something so moving that it conjures emotion, and you fall into like a romantic state of loving life because people do great things. I have, again, my daughters. It's one thing when they watch this stuff on their phones or YouTube all day long. But when I take them to go see an artist on stage, it's so different. So yes, I do think that it's different in that there isn't so much isolation now, that you're influenced by so many more things, but the community and the interaction between people is what's most important, whether it's watching a band or just sort of being a part of a community. Like, that's where great things happen.
Do you worry about the creative process when everybody's influenced by everything? No.
No, I think that I have faith in people's imagination and passion for doing things. Like, we're not done. Music's not done.
I have one more question about that, and then a final question about cities. But talk about the state of rock, if you will, and the guitar-based band.
Yeah.
I'm betraying age when I say that I worry about where that's going, and I say things to my own kids like, there's this thing called guitars, and you could listen to them, and they're really exciting, and they don't. It's not where their heads are at. Talk about the state of rock and roll as we understand it.
Rock
it's like
and
an
roll.
essay question.
Yeah. I mean, it's one that I answer a lot because there are plenty of rock and roll bands. None of them are as good as Bruce Springsteen.
Why do you hate Springsteen so much?
I love Bruce Springsteen. Why do you love him so much? Why do you love him more than me?
I can have love for, I contain multitude.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think that it's still there. When we go on tour, we play these gigantic shows to thousands of people that are singing every word, and it's exciting and it's super fun. So it's hard for me. It's almost hard for me to comment on it because from where I'm standing, it's just great. And people love guitars. People love. I mean, these days when we get up on stage, it's so loud and I'm screaming so hard for 3 hours, and we're going on like right after a guy with a turntable and a microphone, and it's just, I think there's something really exciting about musicians that go out and kind of leave it all on stage. The imperfection of that human performance of just like, that's rock and roll, and it's absolutely still there. It's not at the forefront of the music industry. But listen, if again, my kids, I'm looking at my daughter who's picking up instruments and learning them like one a week. She's going for it. She's got a beautiful voice. She's a great singer. And all she wants to do is like grab a guitar and write a song and perform it for other people. And she's 13. So it's only a matter of time. These things are cyclical too. Like it's only a matter of time before the guitar becomes cool again. So I have faith in the next generation of kids that are going to come out and do things that we just can't even imagine. Right. So it's still there.
Since we have this audience of people who think a lot about cities and how to make them culturally vibrant, do you have any advice for people who are trying to create places where kids can spontaneously create the kind of music that makes their cities vibrant and exciting?
All ages venues, that's a big deal. That was one of the things in Washington, D.C. There weren't too many all ages venues, so we had to make them or find them. And and I learned to play drums by listening to the records of the bands I was going to see. So I was inspired and influenced by the bands that I got to see when I was 14 years old or 15 years old. And had I had to wait until I was 18 or 21, I might have missed that golden hour window of opportunity, which there is, by the way. Every kid in between the ages of 10 and 13, every musician that you've ever seen or heard on the radio, it's in between the ages of 10 and 13 that those kids decide, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. It's really specific. It's not often that you're 25 years old, decide to leave it all behind for a rock band. It happens when you're 10 or 13 years old. But all ages venues I think that's very important to sort of like to grow and foster a community of younger musicians that will end up. I mean, wouldn't you love it if your city was famous for music? Like it'd be so amazing, right? Like when you think of New Orleans, you're like, it's New Orleans, man. New Orleans is famous for jazz, man. And that's like, if every city, and actually, we did New Orleans, we did an episode on the Sonic Highways thing too. We were there for a week, right? Every day I was walking in a parade with a drink in my hand, and there's 500 people walking down the street with the second line band, and parades would just happen like wildfires in Los Angeles. It'd be like, where the fuck did that come from? Like it would just happen like that. And so, but it was allowed, and you could see what that would do to the city. You could see like the joy. It didn't, no matter what was going on in your day, if you heard a second line marching down the street, you're just like, oh, that's so beautiful. If every city would allow that, it sounds crazy and unreasonable, but why not? Like, why not just let music be? Let it walk down the street when it's time to walk down the street, or let a kid who's 14-year-old kid walk into a bar and watch, maybe not a bar, watch a musician that's going to influence them to go on with their lives and do great things. I do think that you have to give the younger generation more credit. I think they deserve more credit, and I think they need a place to be able to be free to play music and parades every day.
Parades every day. Dave, let me just say in closing, for those of you who don't listen to Foo Fighters, it's a great experience to listen to. He's a great.
Almost as good as Bruce Springsteen.
No. I was about to say something nice about you. Jeez, wow.
I get uncomfortable when that happens.
I know. Praise and criticism, right? But I mean, he's a remarkable ambassador for rock, for music, for this particular region, for Seattle. But it really, this is sort of a private view, but it's ultimately comes down to the songs that you make and the shows that you put on. We were talking before about a Foo Fighters show I saw once at George Mason years ago, where the power went out, but they kept playing anyway because that's what we in the audience were demanding, and he was 100%, 150% into it. It was kind of a remarkable, memorable show that wasn't supposed to go that way, but that was what made it memorable.
I got bills to pay, okay? So if I didn't finish that show.
And I will say this about the music. I often start my day in the car by listening to the first minute or two of Enough Space just to get me going.
Wow.
Yeah, just to get me going. I follow it with Rosalita by Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. But then I come back to Learn to Fly, so it's all good. Could you join me in thanking the great Dave Grohl for joining us today?
Thank you very much.
Welcome Bloomberg Philanthropies, Kathleen Carlson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ooh, that's a tough act to follow. My name is Kathleen Carlson. I'm from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the energy from everyone the last couple of days has been incredible. We've had nearly 600 people participating in CityLab DC. Unbelievable. We had the most mayors ever, 44. We had the most chief innovation officers ever, right? Lots of them still in the room. And as a former public servant working in City Hall in both Chicago and New York City, I have to say there is nothing that gives me more joy than being with my people. So thank you. So the end of the day is here, the end of CityLab. And so as we say goodbye, this is a note of gratitude. So special thanks to our incredible underwriters, Amazon Web Services and Intel, Capital One, Exelon, General Motors, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and JBG Smith. Let's give it up for Step Africa, who kicked off the conference. And how about the Chuck Brown Band? So at the museum last night, there were quite a few mayors grooving, and I really want people to know that the mayors have got the rhythm. So hats off to our amazing partners at the Atlantic and the Aspen Institute. Gratitude, we pulled another one off. Speaking of production, hats off to the crews and the staff here at the hotel who have worked so hard to take good care of us the last couple of days. One order of business. You will get in your email and through the app a survey. And I really, really, really need you to fill that out because your feedback to us helps us to improve programming for years to come, and we take it very seriously. Also, if you have any ideas or suggestions, email some of us and let us know what you think we can do better and ideas for another CityLab. These are complicated times in our cities, and we've had some amazing discussions and some complicated discussions, but you know what isn't complicated? What's happening in this room. The optimism, the hope, and Tommy from Helsinki said, the spirit of kindness. So as you leave CityLab, and I hope you learn something here that you can take back to your city, keep that spirit of kindness and take it outside of this room. Thank you.